Welcome to the KuppingerCole Analyst Chat. I'm your host. My name is Matthias Reinwarth. I'm an analyst and advisor at KuppingerCole Analysts. My guest today is again, and I'm really looking forward to that, John Tolbert. He is lead analyst and managing director of KuppingerCole Inc. in Seattle, so the US leg of KuppingerCole. And today we will talk about NDR. Hi, John.
Hello, Matthias.
Good to have you again.
Yeah, great to be here again.
And first of all, we have just an acronym, NDR. This is the starting point. What does this acronym mean?
Well, NDR stands for Network Detection and Response. It's kind of been shortened in general by the industry to match EDR, or Endpoint Detection and Response. But I think there's a letter that's kind of key that we leave out there, and that's T, threat. So it's really Network Threat Detection and Response. It's looking for threats that are on the network that may not have been detected elsewhere. So NDR is Network Detection and Response.
Okay, so that is part of a layered security approach, I understand. So what would be the threats and the dangers that are around that would slip through everything else and that NDR can catch?
Well, yeah, it's kind of viewed in many circles as sort of a last line of defense. Typically, everyone should have endpoint protection or, like next generation anti-malware. So EPP, endpoint protection, that also covers things like URL filtering, endpoint firewall. So it's kind of like a complete package of protecting the endpoint. And then about 8 or 9 years ago, some startups in the security realm created EDR, Endpoint Detection and Response. So that was designed to look at things that may have slipped past the endpoint protection, malware that may have gotten through and was behaving in a stealthy way. So EDR has become somewhat commonplace. It's still not everybody uses it, but most of the big security stack vendors have integrated EDR into their EPP products. So then enter network detection and response. There have been cases where, particularly with APT or advanced persistent threat, these are the incidents that are perpetrated by state actors, usually trying to steal intellectual property or other kinds of secrets. NDR can sit on the network and look for advanced malware and communication that may have been missed by EPP or even EDR products. And that's why sometimes it's the last place to see evidence of some sort of security incident going on.
Okay, so it's that part of security infrastructure that is mostly transparent to the end user. They don't even realize it's there and it's just doing its work. How does it come into your network? I understand there's lots of intelligence in there to understand what's going on. So where actually would this sit? How is it deployed?
Well, you're right. It's not something that end users directly interact with. It's more of an IT shop security kind of solution. It comes in a couple of different forms, either on an appliance, with a hardened OS, and you stick the appliance generally like off of a span or a tap port on your network, and it will take in all the traffic going by and analyze it. In some cases, it can be deployed inline, and by that we mean, given the amount of traffic that is encrypted these days, if you stick an appliance in there and decrypt the traffic and read the traffic, some vendors and their customers believe that's a more effective solution than simply looking at network connection metadata. But there are two very significantly different approaches there. So it's either the inline mode where you're decrypting, or sort of a more passive mode where it's listening and analyzing the network connection metadata. So back to the format, it can either be an appliance, a virtual appliance, or there are cloud images, AMIs, and things like that for infrastructure as a service environments. I will say that with regard to the inline decrypting type of deployment, many vendors and customers are not really interested in that because they see a potential increase in risk by turning the security product into a vector for potential attack. And most companies believe, or most NDR vendors believe, that they can achieve the same level of ability to understand what's going on the network simply by looking at the network connection metadata and applying various machine learning algorithms to it to understand whether or not the traffic itself seems to be malicious or suspicious.
But if we look at the mere amount of data that's going on in such a network, even just looking at the metadata of the network connections is an immense amount of data. So you mentioned already, so it's machine learning that's coming into play here as well. So how are these huge machines that can really do that, or how do they deal with the immense amount of data to identify what's relevant and what's not?
Yeah, in terms of processing power, I think, the appliances are definitely pretty sturdy. And one thing I learned as a result of doing the recent leadership compass on NDR is that I'd say the median traffic flow across an NDR deployment is around 10 gigabits per second, which is pretty impressive when you think about it, that you could either in inline mode or more often the passive mode be able to scan 10 gigabits per second of data and look for anomalous patterns and things like that.
And this is something that the typical IT security analyst then would use. So the input that is gathered by this system would be direct input to the analyst or input to the SOC, to the Security Operations Center.
Yes. So hopefully a lot of the pre-processing is done by the NDR solution with those ML algorithms, but eventually when things are discovered, it would likely go to the SOC and security analysts would take over and investigate it.
Okay, and you've just mentioned that you did this leadership compass. So you have an overview over the products and over the different flavors they come in. What are the typical use cases where you already see this technology being deployed? Where do they play out their strength?
I would say most commonly you find these solutions in organizations that have pretty high security needs. I was mentioning APT, those that feel like they may be under APT attack, whether that's government, defense, aerospace, public utilities, increasingly the oil and gas industry. So large companies and organizations within those industries in particular. But even IoT networks, and especially networks in hospitals and clinics that have IoT devices or devices, with IP addresses. The typical example there is the MRI machine. In many of these cases, they can't run endpoint protection or EDR kinds of clients on these devices because they're just not really capable of it. They don't have a full-fledged operating system, and even trying to add software, invalidates the warranties. So sometimes using a product like NDR on IoT and medical networks is really the only way for getting any kind of information about are there threats on those networks. So those are, I would say, the typical use cases, places where high security is needed, IoT, ICS, SCADA, and medical networks.
For many of our audience, maybe this NDR is just yet another acronym, and it comes across them for the very first time. But is this something that is around for some time? Is it mature? Is it a mature market when it comes to diverse and individual offerings from the vendors?
I would say it's maturing and growing. Again, it has advantages. It can find potential threats in places where other kinds of security solutions have not. So I think there's definitely value for customers that are deploying it. But, at this point, I just discovered as a result of doing the Leadership Compass, not everybody really agrees on the feature set. For example, some companies will tell you sandboxes are out of scope, but a sandbox is let's say a device on the network, an appliance where if you catch what you think is malicious activity or malware, you send it off to the sandbox to execute it in a place where, it can't hurt anything else, and then look at the results. So, I think those are kind of like nice to have features. Not all NDR products do have sandboxes, but, especially in the case where you've got an inline decrypted deployment and you uncover some potential malware, it would be useful to be able to detonate it and see what happens. And then there were other companies the ones that don't offer inline decryption would tend to argue that that's kind of an old style of doing security, and it's weaker. So that really shouldn't be considered part of NDR. But the truth is, at least 12 or 13 companies, I believe, that were in the survey, and they're all doing pretty well. They all have captured a pretty good size of a market that's I think only going to grow and grow. And they may take different approaches with their products and solutions, but that shows that there's room in the market for different approaches as well, I think.
In the earlier episodes of this podcast, you always had a critical look also at the products and had looked at downsides and critical aspects of the solutions. Is there something around this NDR market where you think that there are weaknesses, that are problems around with this type of infrastructure for organizations looking into deploying it?
Well, I think, like a lot of security products, NDR can be pretty complex. I mean, with the focus on machine learning and automating a lot of the tasks that security analysts do, many of the vendors have produced solutions that are not as labor intensive, but you still have to have a SOC or SOC analysts or subscribe to their managed security services to really get the most out of it. So it does take knowledgeable expertise to really get the value out of it. And then one of the other things I learned as a result of doing the Leadership Compass is that, as we were talking about last time, maybe a third of the companies really don't have strong authentication for the administrator and analyst console. And I think that's a significant weakness.
Absolutely. So the Leadership Compass is out right now, I understand. So it's available for interested readers at our website, KuppingerCole.com.
Yes, I think it went out last week.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, John, for giving this insight into, at least for me, a new market segment that I learned much about today. And if anybody listening to us is interested in learning more about NDR beyond the Leadership Compass, and maybe how that can fit into an overall security infrastructure, into a layered approach for them, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. So again, thank you very much, John. Looking forward to having you in a future episode. And I think there is more about NDR that we could talk about. So thank you again.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.